to talk about deadhead fuel systems for a minute. The reason why I want to talk about it is it's generally not the way we typically recommend the fuel system be configured, although we do sell them in this configuration. They do have their place, but there is a better way of doing it. The reason why it tends to still remain popular is because there's some information on one of the internet forums. It's been out there for a number of years, and it's just a good classic case of bad information on the internet. And so I think it's prudent to talk about that information real quick, because I do have to explain this probably on a weekly basis to people. And I've talked to the OP on this forum post, and a lot of you guys watching this video will know which one I'm talking about. And I've told him I disagree with the information that's being portrayed in that post. The information that's being put forth in this post is that by running a fuel system so that the regulator is built before the rails, in other words, he's advocating a deadhead system, is that since the fuel does not circulate through the rails, that the fuel's not picking up the heat as it circulates through the motor before it goes back to the fuel tank. And according to his testing, it makes a difference of up to, I think, something in the range of crazy, like 100 degrees Fahrenheit difference in fuel temperatures versus circulating it through the rails versus not circulating it through the rails. And so with that being said, this forum post is a strong advocate of pre-regulation, in other words, a deadhead fuel system. Now, I got a couple problems with this forum post. One of them is that the measurement of 100 degrees is just complete wrong. There was some mistake made in the measuring process. What it is, I don't know, but it's just not 100 degrees. It's more like a 20-degree range is more realistic. And that is even fairly negligible, because that's generally offset by the fuel is actually cooled as it goes through the feed line up and then the return line back there, especially if you're running like a PTFE line that has a lot of a decent amount of surface area in it, and it dissipates heat very quickly because it has a thin core and stainless braid. As long as you're not like wrapping it around your exhaust or something hot, it does dissipate heat quite well, and it does negate that. Another problem I have with this is the temperature was being measured in the return line. What is relevant is not what's the temperature of the fuel is in the return line, but it's the temperature of the fuel, in other words, the density of the fuel that we're delivering to the injectors, and they completely neglected that in this post. And that's why I just have a fundamental flaw in the data that's presented there. Now, when you run a flow-through type fuel system, in other words, what they're not advocating, right? The fuel is continuously circulated through the rails, so you have a relatively consistent temperature that's available to all injectors at any given time. So whether you're sitting at a stoplight, or you're cruising down the road, or you're on the dyno, or you're on the track, you generally have the same temperature fuel available all the time. Now, in a deadhead system, essentially what happens is when you're sitting there cruising or idling, it's like sitting in a long life cycle, for instance, the fuel is just sitting in the rails, and it's only being consumed at a rate that which your injectors are pushing it through just to make the car idle. So the fuel is spending a whole lot of time in the rails, and they didn't measure the fuel temperature being discharged from the injectors. Now, I've got customers that have found that running a deadhead type system is sometimes so detrimental that even sitting at a long traffic light, and they go to launch the car coming off the traffic light, or sitting in the staging lanes for a long time, and then eventually doing their burnout, and then they're sitting there waiting for the other car to stage, and then they end up lean bogging because the fuel loses that much density because of the temperature rise from just sitting in the rails. I mean, keep in mind, fuel rails often 220 to 250 degrees. You know, that's what your fuel's going to end up if it just sits there, right? It's going to be smoking hot, right? And by the way, that's probably beyond the limits of the trim anyways in the ECU. So that's why you get the lean bog. Now, the other problem I have with the deadhead fuel system is the starting characteristics. So if you have a big fuel system in your car, and it doesn't matter if you have it pre-regulated, post-regular, deadhead, or flow-through, whatever you want to call it, and you have big feed line, you have big filters. In other words, you got a lot of volume in your feed circuit, and you got big pumps that discharge a lot of fuel, and it's probably heated as well. Keep in mind that even if you have check valves in the system, it doesn't matter. When you shut down the fuel pumps, the fuel temperature will drop a little bit, and as soon as it drops just a tad, the fuel pressure bleeds off, and then the fuel vaporizes in the rails. And if you've ever cracked a fuel rail off on a car that has a built fuel system in it, big, like I said, big feed lines, big pumps, everything else, when it's hot, guess what? The fuel rails are dry. They're dry because the fuel vaporizes in it. Now, not the case with an OE car with a small pump, small feed circuit, you know, low volume in the feed circuit. You know, if you crack the line off the fuel rails, now you better have a rag over it, of course, or you're going to get sprayed with fuel. But we're talking about big fuel systems here, built fuel systems. It's going to be dry. You're going to have vapor. So whether you have the regulator before the rails or after the rails, it's going to be dry in the rails when you go to restart the car. Now, on a flow-through type fuel system, right, or a post-regulated fuel system, the moment that fuel pump comes online, it's going to purge the vapor out of those rails. It's going to have liquid fuel available to those injectors for a pretty clean engine start. Right now, if you pre-regulate the fuel system, in other words, you deadhead the fuel system, you're still going to have that vapor that's in the rails, right? But when you go to prime the pumps, how are you getting the vapor out of the rails? Through the injectors, and that's a pretty slow process, and so it can lead to really long crank times. And so some people have found that using this deadhead system have ended up switching over to a flow-through system after they are sick and tired of long engine start times. Sometimes with big injectors, tuners can get a little creative with their hot start tables, and they can get those injectors flowing, getting that vapor out as faster, or that vapor will help light off the motor to help it crank. But still, you're kind of working around kind of a detriment, and that still doesn't solve the problem of when you're sitting in that long traffic light, or you're sitting still for a while, and you go to get on the car, you go to launch it, and then there's a very low density fuel initially available to those injectors, and then so you get your lean bogged. So anyways, that's my whole case on the pre-regulated versus post-regulated. Now, why does even anybody sell? Why do we sell a deadhead fuel system? Well, it does have its place. Show car guys love the deadhead fuel systems. Okay, reason why: they like their engine compartment to be nice and clean, right? A pre-regulated fuel system, when you can put the regulator up in the fender or on the firewall. You're not doing that if you're going to the track, because NHRA tech won't allow it. And then you can run feed line to the back of each rail. You put plugs on the front of the rails, and you have a really nice clean fuel system. You don't have fuel lines running all over the place, so it looks real good. Never mind that it takes forever to crank the car when you go to leave the show. Never mind, I'm not going to get into that. So anyways, those guys really like it. Now, there's some other cases where maybe your supercharger configuration or your intake configuration or the way you've configured something else in the car works out in such a manner that you can't get it fitting on the front and the back of both rails. Because if you do a flow-through fuel system, you've got it, whether you do a series setup, and that's, in other words, you know, you run feed line to one side, crossover line, come out the back to the regulator, or you do like a Y-block type setup where you split the feed, go to the back of both rails, then off the front of both rails to the regulator. Whether you do that, you've got to have a fitting on the front and back of both rails. So it ends up being, a flow-through type system ends up being a little bit of a messier install. You know, you have to give a little bit more thought to how you're going to run your fuel lines if you want it to look good.